is hatred. Each night, the African plains become a battlefield for this ancient blood feud. A shocking look at a dark side of nature. Eternal Enemies, a National Geographic special.
Tune in to Iowa Public Television, Wednesday at 7.
You're watching Iowa Public Television.
TV worth watching, IPTV.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And funding for the Iowa broadcast is provided by Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, since 1861, an environment for academic excellence. And by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour.
Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff in Washington.
And I'm Jim Lehrer in New York. After our summary of the news this Tuesday, we will explore expectations about the return of Congress with its leaders, Senators Mitchell and Simpson, Representatives FOLEY and MICHEL. Then the prospects for Cuba, a last holdout in the world of communism.
Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T and by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
The Supreme Court today agreed to hear arguments in a case challenging Pennsylvania's abortion law. It is considered one of the strictest in the nation. It requires women, or doctors rather, to inform women about fetal development and alternatives to abortion. It also requires parental consent for minors, notification of husbands in some cases, and a 24-hour waiting period. Groups on both sides of the abortion debate had hoped that the court would use this case to re-examine its 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, which legalized abortions. But in today's announcement, the court said it would limit its review to the specific provisions of Pennsylvania's law. The announcement drew these reactions.
But they cannot and will not uphold the Pennsylvania law without overruling the fundamental right to choose. You cannot uphold restrictions that cause women difficulty in obtaining an abortion or acting on their decision and still say there's a fundamental right. So there's no way that they can examine and hear the Pennsylvania case without getting to the question of whether there is a fundamental right to choose or not.
We're very concerned that the Supreme Court should overturn Roe v. Wade within the next few years. We want it to happen right away because we've been waiting for it for 19 years. And we'll look forward to that. Whether or not they do it with this case is just speculation. We've asked the court in every case that's come before it to overturn Roe v. Wade because it's bad law and it encourages abortion, but we look forward to it being overturned.
The court will hear arguments in late March or early April. A decision is expected by July. This morning, anti-abortion protesters blockaded 2 Washington, D.C. clinics which perform abortions. Abortion rights supporters held a counter-demonstration. Police said they made more than 270 arrests. Jim?
The United Nations Security Council today demanded Libya surrender 2 men indicted in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. The resolution was approved unanimously by the 15-member council. 259 people on board and 11 on the ground were killed when the plane exploded over Scotland in December 1988. The United States and Britain indicted 2 Libyan security agents in the bombing. U.S. Ambassador Thomas Pickering spoke after today's vote.
The Council expects Libyan compliance with the resolution, which it has just passed. The enormity of the crimes committed and the onslaught against international peace and security demand no less. The Council will be watching carefully how Libya responds. The Council will proceed in a step-by-step manner, I am sure, to maintain its commitment to international peace and security.
U.S. and British diplomats have said they will propose sanctions against Libya if it does not comply with the UN and hand over those agents. The Cuban government announced today it would fight dissidents with every means and in every arena. The warning came in an official newspaper one day after the execution of a Cuban exile. He was one of 3 convicted by a Cuban court of sabotage and anti-government terrorism. The other 2 received 30-year jail sentences. Cuban officials said the 3 infiltrated Cuba from the United States last month carrying arms and explosives. In Washington, State Department spokesman Richard Boucher condemned the execution. He said it and the crackdown on dissidents revealed a pattern of brutality.
A Japanese government spokesman today denied that it was reneging on its pledge to buy more U.S. cars. Japanese Prime Minister Miyazawa yesterday suggested that Japan had made no promises on auto imports, but his spokesman today said that Japan fully intended to live up to its pledge. In this country, United Technologies Corporation said that it will cut nearly 14,000 jobs over the next 4 years. The aerospace company said that it also will take a $1 billion loss in 1991 as it launches a cost-cutting program. The plan calls for closing 100 plants worldwide. The company said the moves were brought on by shrinking defense spending and the recession.
The National Urban League issued a report today claiming black Americans are in deep economic trouble, and neither President Bush nor his Democratic and Republican challengers have a plan to do anything about it. It was one of the major conclusions in the Civil Rights Group's 17th annual report on the state of black America. League President John Jacobs spoke at a Washington news conference.
Every indicator of economic well-being, whether unemployment rates or poverty rates or income, shows that African Americans are doing far worse than whites. We were in a recession before the recession hit, and now we are in an economic depression.
President Bush today proposed spending $600 million more on Head Start. He announced it at a Head Start center in Catonsville, Maryland. He said the increase will allow every eligible 4-year-old child with parental consent the opportunity to participate in the preschool program. Head Start now serves more than 600,000 children a year with education, health, and nutrition services. Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts and other Democrats are proposing a larger increase, $1 billion for next year, more than $5 billion in the next 5 years. New Jersey's Governor Jim Florio today signed a welfare reform bill which prevents women from receiving additional benefits when they have more children. It is the first state to pass such a regulation. Opponents say it is unconstitutional.
In France, officials have formed a special commission to investigate yesterday's crash of a passenger jet near Strasbourg. 96 people were on board the Airbus A320 when it went down. All but 9 were killed. The crash has renewed questions about the jet's safety. We have a report by Libby Wiener of Independent Television News.
All day, rescue workers have been patiently sifting through the wreckage of the Airbus, searching for the bodies of those killed. Late this afternoon, some were still being recovered. The plane, though flying low, was within feet of clearing the mountaintop when its undercarriage struck the trees, tearing the fuselage apart. There was apparently no warning that the Airbus was off course, and there was no distress signal. It was in the tail section of the Airbus just behind me that most of the survivors were seated. Remarkably, after the accident, many of them were well enough to walk away and find their rescuers. But it was still 5 hours before the emergency services reached the mountaintop. The survivors who were injured waited in freezing temperatures beside the wreckage, lighting a fire to try and keep warm. It's believed some of those trapped inside the plane died simply from exposure. Among the survivors, a 9-year-old boy. And the youngest of the passengers, 13-month-old Melisandre Andre, carried away in the arms of a soldier, apparently unhurt. It was a tortuous and distressing task, some of the survivors critically injured. 4 years ago, an Airbus A320 crashed at an air show at Mulhouse in France, ploughing into the trees after attempting a low-level pass. Although the official inquiry blamed the pilot, French pilots have raised questions about the safety of the A320's computerized cockpit and its fly-by-wire system, where computers pass on the pilot's commands to the plane's flying surfaces. The crash will add to that debate over what was supposed to be the world's most sophisticated passenger aircraft.
The Space Shuttle Discovery is back on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Forecasters are predicting good weather for a liftoff scheduled for 8:53 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. The shuttle will carry 7 astronauts plus thousands of plants, eggs, and insects, among other things, on a 7-day scientific mission. And that's it for the news summary tonight. Now it's on to congressional expectations and Cuba, the communist holdout. The return of Congress is our lead story tonight. Not that much has changed since it recessed for the holidays 8 weeks ago. It is still part of a divided government. The Democrats remain in the majority and in charge of Congress. President Bush remains president and a Republican. The sour economy remains sour and the leading issue, and it is still an election year. Senate Minority Leader Robert Dole took to the Senate floor this afternoon to state his view of the problem.
Congress is back in town. It's another year, it's another session, another State of the Union just around the corner. But before anyone starts believing that all these facts add up to business as usual, let me tell you how dead wrong that assumption would be. There are just too many issues, too many problems demanding our attention for us to begin this session of Congress with a business as usual attitude. You can't go anywhere these days without hearing the people and hearing them loudly and clearly do something and do it quickly for a change, they're telling us. Well, it's time to listen to the American people, even on Capitol Hill, even in the White House, and yes, even in an election year. Oh, the temptation will be great, with the election only 288 days away. The temptation will be great, indeed, to block anything the president might want or play games with some Democrat or Republican initiative. I know a lot of attention is being paid these days to polls and presidential popularity. No doubt about it, the president is the biggest target in town. The people understand that Congress is just as accountable as the President of the United States, and they see Congress as part of the problem, not the solution, and they will be taking names. It's no wonder they're fed up with the business-as-usual congressional agenda. So if the American people are to believe all the rhetoric and all the speeches they've been hearing since Congress left town a month and a half ago about the economy and about health care and all the other challenges facing us this year, then we'd better start delivering instead of just complaining or promising. It's time to make the people's agenda our #1 priority around here instead of our next election. My guess is that anyone ignoring this advice could well be looking for another line of work come 1993.
The top leadership of Congress is with us now from studios on Capitol Hill. Democrats, Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell of Maine, House Speaker Tom Foley of Washington State. Republicans, Senate Minority Whip Alan Simpson of Wyoming, and House Minority Leader Bob Michel of Illinois. Senator Mitchell, do you agree the heat is on for Congress to do something and do it quickly?
I think the heat is on everyone in government to do something and do it quickly. There is a serious problem with our economy. The rate of unemployment is rising and the economy is flat. I think it's incumbent on all of us to act to do what we can to lift the country out of recession and to lay the foundation for sustained long-term economic growth in the future.
Speaker Foley, President Bush admitted in New Hampshire last week that he was slow to pick up on the gravity of the economic situation in this country. Were you and your colleagues also slow to come to grips with that?
Well, I don't think we plead guilty to that. We tried last year to move on a bigger Surface Transportation Act than the administration wanted. We pushed very hard early for unemployment compensation that was rejected, first by the president not declaring an emergency and secondly by vetoing the bill. We've been, for some months now, stressing the need to provide a middle-income tax relief, not only for fairness, but for stimulation of a very sluggish economic confidence on the part of the public. But certainly I agree that we ought to work together to accomplish that. But I think that the record is Congress has been ahead on this issue.
Congressman Michel, you heard now what Senator Mitchell and Speaker Foley said, and we just played a moment ago what Senator Dole said. From your perspective, and anybody watching this program, should they expect Congress to do much about the economy over the next several weeks and months?
Well, I don't think we can, the American people should think that the Congress can wave a magic wand and there's going to be a magic quick fix to this thing, either from the Congress or from the President. That isn't the nature of our economy. However, I think we have to do the kind of things that would stimulate at least some measure of confidence that we do have some right things that we could do and refrain from doing the bad things. For example, most of the jobs are created by small business in this country, not by big business, so I think we'd want to refrain from imposing new mandates on a number of our small businesses. By the same token, I think there's some economic spurs that we could give to the economy by way of first-time home buyers, maybe a tax credit, something of that nature in business and industry, whether it's investment tax credit or depreciation liberalization, something that spurs the entrepreneurs in this country who create the jobs to do just that. And then, of course, the investment climate ought to also be improved because we've got to be saving more in our country and rewarding those savings that eventually give us capital to spend and create jobs.
Senator Simpson, you agree the heat is on for you all to do something?
Oh, I do indeed, and it isn't going to be business as usual. I think anyone that just goes home in these next weeks and months and just says, well, you'll be proud of me, I diddled the Democrats today or last week, or I diddled the Republicans, is going to pay for that at the polls. And there are a lot of incumbents who are coming up, a third of the U.S. Senate, more than a third this time, and then the entire House. And I think that, oddly enough, in an election year, we might find more cooperation than we would find in a non-election year. That is the ultimate naive comment.
You mean out of political fear?
A fear?
You mean that there's enough political fear among you Republicans and the Democrats that you're going to have to get together whether you want to or not?
I think the people are going to demand that. They're going to say, what are you doing? Don't give us the old stuff about how you hammered Bush or how he hammered Congress or he took on George Mitchell or George Mitchell took on George Bush. That's really old stuff, and I respect George Mitchell greatly. I've known him, you know, we work on 2 committees together. So I think he's ready for that. I think George Bush is ready for that. The State of the Union will set the tone. Democrats will have their own views, but these things that happened last year in vetoes, they were presented to the president to get a veto, and no other reason. And that's not the way it's got to be.
Senator Mitchell, you and the President have been exchanging hammering blows lately. Is that suddenly, as of today, now that the Senate is back in session and the House is back in session, going to stop and you all are going to get together?
Well, actually, the blows get the press. The substance of agreement does not. The striking thing about the statements made in recent weeks is that I have consistently supported, in fact, I introduced legislation last year for a tax credit on first-time home buyers. I support a limited incremental investment tax credit, and I, for 5 years, have fought for middle-income tax relief. I offered the principal amendment to the 1986 Tax Act. The purpose of my amendment was to have greater relief for middle-income taxpayers. It now appears that most or perhaps all of these will be included in the President's State of the Union address, at least those are the indications we have. So I think the more remarkable thing about the statements of recent weeks, although they really haven't gotten the attention, and I understand controversy and clashing is news, is the degree to which there may be agreement which may enable us to move forward and to get something done. I believe, have said many times, that the best politics is to do what's right. If you do what's right, it turns out to be politically better. I think we can all benefit, and most importantly, the well-being of the American people can benefit if we can come together on a significant economic recovery program.
Congressman Michel, just as a matter of strategy, among other things, political or otherwise, has President Bush made a really serious error in holding everything off until the State of the Union and not bringing you all back and not proposing something earlier and getting on with this economic problem?
Well, I don't think so, unless it would have been the case where we had a specific game plan in action. I don't think there was one until the severity of the problem was analyzed carefully by the administration to the degree that the President wanted to highlight it in his State of the Union message, make a fresh start. I think to try and throw something quickly together at the closing days of the last session was not in the cards. And as I said earlier on, I think whatever we want to do right. and refrain from doing the bad things. And the Speaker and I have worked together on occasion, probably more cases than not. And I'd hope that we could really concentrate on the economic recovery package right up front earlier on, maybe by, say, set a deadline of March 15th and go all out to do that. Some of the other things, then, we're going to have plenty of time for the politics and the give and take of a presidential election year, and some of the more broader scale things that will definitely take more time. But let's do what we can in the next first 60, 90 days and working together. That's my view.
Speaker Foley, is Congressman Michael speaking real world there? March 15th, an economic recovery package that could pass the Congress and be on the President's desk by then?
Well, I think very shortly after that, if not on that date exactly. There's no reason for us to avoid trying to work together, not only because the public will demand it, but because that's the desire of members of Congress. They see the problems in their own constituencies and states. They know the country has economic stress, and families all over the country are experiencing great hardship. There's a desire, a strong desire, to work together, to move to try to ameliorate this problem as soon as possible and to try to develop a workable program. So there's internal reasons as well as external political reasons.
Mr. Foley,
I'm not universally happy with exact deadlines and exact dates, but there's no reason to believe we can't move urgently and quickly.
There are some economists, Mr. Speaker, who say that you all have gotten yourself caught in a kind of political shell game because there is absolutely nothing that you all could pass, and even by March the 15th would have that much of an immediate effect on economic recovery, that it's long-term no matter what you do. Is that correct?
Well, that's what some economists say. That's correct. I'm not sure that there aren't actions we could take that would help both in long-term economic growth and in the short-term confidence of the country. One of the problems is people are not responding as they usually would to buy houses, to buy cars, to buy durables, because of the fear that the economy is going to get worse for a variety of reasons. There's a clutching and a concern even by people who have jobs and normally would be engaging in some investment or spending. I think the actions of Congress can perhaps persuade people, not only perhaps persuade them, but give them some incentive in terms of some reasonable tax reduction to move forward and to release that energy in the economy that's been so lacking.
All right.
In terms of long-term growth, I think we can take some actions that will help in that area and will in turn lay the groundwork for economic performance in the future.
All right, beginning with you, Senator Simpson. Obviously, we can't go through the whole thing here, but if you had to, on your list, your own personal list, not the Republican parties, not the Senate Republican leadership, but your own list, if you had to pick one thing that Congress could do quickly that would either send the right message or the reality to help the economic recovery, what would it be, sir?
Well, there's a lot of difference there.
I know.
If you really wanted to do something, you start doing something with the entitlements programs of the United States. And you get into a little more of this, those who are able to pay are going to have to pay more. And you deal with, honestly...
You mean like Social Security, people, the upper income don't get Social Security benefits?
I'm talking about Part B premiums on Medicare, which are now 75% of them paid by Joe taxpayer and 25% by some who are just, you know, well-to-do. But let me tell you, that's a good way to get destroyed. The people cry out for this reform, and the only way it will ever get done is when you deal with an $820 billion health care system and $250 billion in Social Security and all of the entitlements programs. And I'm not talking about knocking people off and out into the streets. I'm talking about reality. And that's the only place. The debt has got to be serviced, and that's $250 billion a year. We could really get some of that back.
Senator Mitchell, what would be at the top of your list, sir?
Well, first, Jim, I'll respond to the question, but it should be made clear that no one thing is going to turn the economy around.
I understand that.
It's going to take a combination of several things. Sure. I believe that a one-time program of assistance to states and cities to help them meet their severe budget problems would be high on my list, along with the others that I mentioned, a middle-income tax cut, credits for home buyers, and an investment tax credit. I think a combination of that type would provide a stimulus to the economy. And I think it's very important to emphasize the point that the Speaker made. When you go back and look at the history of the New Deal, the single most significant effect of President Roosevelt's actions was to restore confidence. It was not in any one or combination of programs. And what's lacking in this country today is confidence about the immediate future. I've had many businessmen tell me that customers have the cash, they don't have the will. And what we've got to do is to try as we can, as best we can, in a limited way, with the administration to help to restore that confidence.
Congressman Michael, do you agree with that we're really talking about more confidence here than we are reality?
Absolutely. When I was home in my own district there, I just got that sense of feeling. I have 9.5% unemployment in Illinois, worse up to 15, 16% in a couple of my counties. We have an extended strike of the largest industry that contributes part to that. But I would say, first of all, in that growth package, we ought to also have a provision for extending unemployment insurance benefits, probably another 13 weeks or so, for those who are really destitute. I think that bridges the gap. But then going back to those earlier ones that both Senator Mitchell and I were talking about, that creates the jobs among small independent businesses primarily, to get people back to work. And that confidence factor is such a big one up there. I remember in the recession as far back as 1958, you auto buy now. We were trying to sell people, loosen up, you know, you got it to spend, but the people have to have, as the speaker indicated a little bit earlier, that long-range confidence that things aren't going to get worse, they're actually going to get better. And I look at the stock market today, and some of the people happen to think that maybe there is some growth out there coming just down the road a ways.
Speaker Foley, what would be at the top of your list that would do what you think needs to be done?
Well, in terms of the immediate thing, I think probably passing an extension of unemployment compensation only because we have benefits that are going to be lapsing in February and March. That needs to be done very quickly. I think it's very difficult to talk about particulars. We have to see what the president's going to offer, what his recommendations are. Obviously, there are a variety of things we could do. They've been mentioned by the others. Some incremental investment tax credits, some middle income tax relief, some provisions for growth encouragement in the future. All of these things could be part of a package which Congress could pass. The important thing is that we try to find areas of agreement, that we work together, and we try to bring it about as soon as reasonably possible. I think all those things can be done, the Congress and the two parties working together, and I think the will exists to do that, as I repeat, not just because of political concerns or political fear of retribution at the polls, but the Congress, the responsible members of Congress know that the country needs to move forward economically. We have a crisis that needs to be addressed, and they're willing and anxious to do it.
But Mr. Speaker, you wouldn't dispute Senator Simpson's point that there is political heat under the chairs up there.
No, I don't dispute that. I'm not arguing against the point, except to say that sometimes the impression is given that if there wasn't political heat, we'd be ignoring the problems. We'd be going on merrily to engage in some kind of political games relentlessly in an election year without addressing the problems. I think that ignores the other side of the reality here, that in addition to political focus and pressure from home, there's a recognition on the part of members of Congress, House and Senate, and in both parties, that there needs to be action, that we have constructive responsibilities here that are apart from politics and in addition to whatever political heat is felt.
Senator Simpson, how do you feel about the blame part of the equation? As I mentioned in a question to Speaker Foley, the president did go to New Hampshire and say, okay, I blew it. I wasn't paying enough attention. This thing got out of hand, and I'm sorry. Do you feel that way as a member of the Senate leadership?
Well, I think that there was a lack of recognition, and I think it was, you know, there was a confusion there as to communicating that to the president. But we've all heard right now that we're going to do the first thing, which is going to be unemployment and take care of people who are on unemployment compensation. But you watch, that sounds great, but I tell you what we're talking about is the insured unemployed, and the reason that baby didn't go anywhere the last time is because they put a new formula together that just broadened it to break the bank. The reason the transportation bill didn't go anywhere the last time and got into veto bait was because the people, Democrats and Republicans alike, who were involved most actively in the committee and subcommittees, had taken on a huge part of the budget. I mean, this is the way it goes.
Am I reading you correctly when I say what you are saying is don't hold your breath?
No, I would say, yeah, you can go ahead and hold your breath. That would be a very good thing to do. But I don't think it will be as bad as in a non-election year for the various things. What Tom says, fear, the willingness to do right, the willingness to help, that's something politicians do. We love to be loved. There's a way to do that. You do your work.
All right. You agree with that, Senator Mitchell, in a word?
Yes, I do, but
With everything that he said, you agree with
No, I don't agree with everything that he said. I'm not sure I understand it all. But,
yes, you did, George.
Let me say that there's nothing unusual about that. That's called accountability in a democracy. There ought to be a concern about the desires, hopes, and aspirations of the people. That's why we have elections. That's why we don't have a permanent situation. And so I think
we've lost some.
I think it's a good thing. I think it's a healthy thing. And I think that people are and ought to be responsive, elected officials, to the people they represent.
All right, gentlemen, let's leave it there. Thank you all four very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We turn our focus now to Fidel Castro's Cuba, one of the world's few remaining communist regimes and just 90 miles from the United States. Yesterday, the Castro government put to death one of 3 Cuban exiles from Miami who were caught in Cuba last month with explosives and firearms. The other 2 exiles were given 30-year prison sentences. The men had traveled in a small boat from Florida where they had trained with an anti-Castro group. The United States today condemned the execution and denied Cuban charges that the U.S. sponsored the exile mission. The announcement of the execution was accompanied by an official statement warning Cubans and foreigners that the Castro government will not tolerate opposition. The Reuters news agency quoted diplomats in Havana as saying a crackdown on internal dissidents was well underway. In a moment, we will get 3 views of Castro's prospects for holding on to power, more than 30 years after his revolution. But we begin now with a report from Cuba, prepared by David Halton of the CBC.
Santiago, Cuba. Tens of thousands of Cubans are out for Fidel Castro's latest rally. A tropical storm breaks.
Para salvar la revolución.
Castro appeals to his people to save what he calls the last true island of revolution.
Y rodeado de capitalismo por todas partes.
Surrounded by capitalism.
En un islote de revolución entre el Atlántico y
An island of revolution between the Atlantic and the Pacific.
En un islote de revolución en este hemisferio.
An island of revolution in this hemisphere.
En un islote de revolución.
An island of revolution in the West.
And an island where Castro's 32-year-old revolution is now facing a crisis of survival. The disintegration of the Soviet Union, the end of Leninism in Eastern Europe, have pulled away the support systems that kept Cuba alive. The once bustling port of Havana is quiet now. It used to be full of Soviet bloc ships bringing in food, spare parts, consumer products, above all the Soviet oil that Cuba depended on for more than 90% of its needs. Without Soviet oil, almost half Cuba's factories have already been forced to shut down, and its transport system paralyzed. Bus driver Antonio Quimares won't be driving much longer. Already half the country's buses are off the road for lack of gas, something he can't believe is happening. His wife, Fina, is struggling with another kind of pressure, the ordeal of shopping these days, in a country where for the past few months almost everything has been rationed. Today there's bread, but when Fina shows up at this store for milk, none has arrived, and her neighbors are angry. We've been lining up since 5 a.m., says a neighbor. There was milk yesterday, but we don't know when it'll come in today. I guess I'll have to invent something, says this woman, something to feed the kids for lunch. What's so alarming for Cubans is not just that almost everything is rationed now, but that even with rationing, the stores are often empty. In the 80s, Cubans had got used to one of the best living standards in the third world. Now, suddenly, they seem to be plunged back into the kind of poverty they thought they'd left behind. Back home, Fina Quimares wonders how much worse things can get.
It is more difficult because you have to go out searching for food. There are shortages at home and the family wants to come home and find their food ready and they don't find it.
But what is remarkable with the Quimares family, like many other Cubans we talk to, is that even in face of their current hardships, they are still supporting Fidel Castro. Castro, they say, is close to his people, unlike the old guard of communist leaders who were kicked out in Eastern Europe. Castro's socialism, they claim, won't collapse because it's rooted in national pride and social justice. Even under today's tough conditions, says Antonio Quimares, life is better than it was before Cuba's 1959 revolution.
Before, there was everything in the stores, but we couldn't afford to buy it. We went through a lot of hunger. Now I have two daughters. One is 27 and the other is 25, and they have not been hungry. They have never gone without breakfast, lunch, or dinner so far. And I don't think they will, because they always have something to eat.
Antonio then starts talking about the hospitals and the free medicine in Cuba that, according to United Nations estimates, have given Cubans the best health services, the lowest infant mortality, and the longest lives of any people in Latin America.
Do you think we would give this up and go back to where we were before? To experience misery, hardship, and mistreatment? Never. That's why I'm telling you that we have to die for this. We will take care of this all our life. And we think that our children and our grandchildren will follow us, our example, and take care of this, because we will never go back.
But in 2 weeks here, we talked to dozens of other Cubans with a much darker view of the situation. People who said their lives here were becoming unbearable, who said their faith in the revolution is close to being exhausted if they hadn't already lost it. They were mostly younger Cubans, like these students and workers born after the revolution, who said they were too afraid to reveal their identities.
Shortages. Cigarettes, tobacco, cooking oil, lard, clothes, running shoes, pants, electricity, gas, rice, electric stoves, pressure cookers, coffee pots, watches, food.
Everything.
Life. Life.
Today is worse than yesterday, and tomorrow will be worse.
There's nothing. There's no food. There are no clothes. Everything affects you. There's no entertainment for young people.
And what about Fidel Castro, we asked them?
I hate him. I think that he's a fanatic with his revolution and his ideas. And he wants his revolution at all costs. He doesn't want to give in.
We asked if the situation in Cuba could become explosive.
All that you have to do is light a match and it'll blow up. Just one person has to light a lighter and it'll blow up. I'm not going to do it. Nor is he. Nor is he. But if someone is courageous enough to do it, it'll happen.
What are we going to do? Rise up in arms? We don't see any possibility of that because nobody here wants to become a martyr of the revolution.
That attitude may soon change. As the economic crisis in Cuba gets worse, Castro is beginning to implement the first stage of what he calls the zero option. Under the zero option, oxen will replace tractors and farm machines that can no longer function without gas. Cubans will return to almost pre-industrial conditions to produce enough food to survive. Already, tens of thousands of Cubans have been moved from Havana to work in the fields. This is not Cambodia. They come voluntarily, says Deputy Minister Sanchez Perotti.
In no way we are going to force people to move to the countryside. What we are going to do is to create conditions, better wages, better living conditions, all that, for those who live in the cities, for example, or in other places, and would like to go there, create those conditions and attract people.
The promised better conditions are new rural apartment complexes like this one, where the government claims the medical facilities and the schools will be up to the high level Cubans are used to. The teacher here, Maria Chavez Veiz, says Cubans will accept moving to the countryside and adopt the zero option. Socialism, she says, takes precedence over everything. That's why we say socialism or death. In Havana, though, many Cubans are tiring of the old Castro slogan, socialism or death. Many are worried about giving up the few remaining pleasures of city life, worried about moving to the countryside under the chilling prospects of the zero option. They have reason to be worried, says social scientist Heraldo Dia, and so does Castro.
We have to recognize that what causes riots and uprisings in the world is not poverty, but rather the process of getting poorer. And that's what we are going through in Cuba right now. A process of getting poorer. That is a very important point.
But at a news conference, Castro says don't underestimate Cubans. They won't give up the gains of the revolution.
In Cuba, all our children go to school. They even have uniforms. You don't find any children on the streets, cleaning windshields or barefoot. If they're barefoot, it's only because they want to be.
But Castro isn't taking any chances. His police and security networks continue to arrest dissidents. There are now more than 2,000 political prisoners in Cuba, according to human rights activist Elizardo Sanchez, who spent 8 of the past 10 years in jail.
Castro's social base is shrinking day by day, rapidly. It's incredible. It's like an erosion process. He's losing his support. And the popularity that Castro still has is the same as Ceausescu had in Romania months before he was overthrown.
Politburo Minister Abel Prieto.
I don't know what any new form of capitalism installed in Cuba would reign over. It would have to reign over a big bloodbath, a big massacre, because this country is not going to surrender.
Apocalyptic words like those are feeding the siege mentality that's now gripping Cuba. Young reservists are being called up for accelerated army training. Tunnels are being built in Havana for bomb shelters as Cuban communists talk of a last stand for socialism. Sunday in Havana. Cubans are out doing what they love to do, dancing. Castro's supporters are still talking about what they call their tropical socialism, a gentler, more easygoing version, they claim, of the communism that has disappeared in Eastern Europe. But as Cuba moves into the next stage of the zero option, bleaker images are taking over, and many Cubans are wondering whether they are now in the twilight of their revolution.
3 perspectives now on the future of Fidel Castro's Cuba. ALICIA Torres is the executive director of the Cuban-American Committee. She was in Cuba last month. GILLIAN GUNN is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the director of its project on Cuba after the Cold War. She met with President Castro last month for about 3 hours. And Ernesto Betancourt, the former director of Radio Marti in Miami and Fidel Castro's envoy to Washington in the early years of the Cuban Revolution. I want to start by asking all 3 of you if the portrait that we just saw in that report fits with your understanding and your sense of how much suffering there is underway right now in Cuba. Ms. Torres?
Yes, I think that Cuba is facing one of the most severe economic crises that it has in its history. And for the second time in less than 30 years, Cuba has been totally disengaged from its major trading partner. Now, the difference between this time and the time before is that, in essence, Cuba has developed in the past 30 years a tremendous infrastructure. And right now, many of those factories and plants are shut down because of lack of raw materials and because of lack of petroleum to run them. So it's basically passing through a transitional period through which Cuba is looking for foreign partners and moving its economy towards a mixed economy. Many of our allies are investing in Cuba. Many of our Latin American countries, of the Europeans, are investing in Cuba. So I would say that it is true that there is a very severe economic crisis in Cuba that is affecting even the ability to have penicillin in Cuba.
Ms. Gunn, you were also in Cuba last month. Is this square with what your reading of the situation is?
Yes, I was in Cuba in November for 3 weeks, and then I was in Cuba again for a week, coming back just last week. And I would say that the short documentary was very accurate, with only two possible additions. One is that the vegetable crop does come through in Cuba from December to approximately May, and therefore what you see in the streets of Cuba is a lot of apprehension about the future, realizing that trade with the Eastern Bloc is virtually non-existent, and a lot of fear what's going to happen after the vegetable crop finishes, because they're not very good food processing facilities. Therefore there'll be a lot of fresh vegetables.
After May, in other
That's right.
words.
There's a lot of fresh vegetables now. People are not really suffering right now. There's a lot of anxiety. Food is short, but there's no hunger because the vegetables are fresh and available. So there's a lot of apprehension about what happens after May. The only other addition I would make to the documentary would be that there was a failure to note the racial breakdown of the support for the revolution. Various people estimate the percentage of non-whites in Cuba between 40 and 60%. And I certainly have found in my discussions that there is a tendency on the part of the non-white population to be very impatient with exiled proposals of alternative government structures because there's a sense that
Meaning they're more supportive of Castro?
They might not be particularly more supportive of Castro, but they're more distrustful of alternatives they see put forward by whites abroad.
How do you see, Mr. Betancourt, the breakdown of support for Fidel Castro? We saw the interview with the bus driver who remains very supportive, and then we saw the interview with the group of younger people whose faces were obscured. But how much support is there in Cuba for Fidel Castro still?
Well, this is a highly repressive regime, and therefore many people will say what they think is safe for them to say. When I was director of Radio Marti, we interviewed people coming out, and quite frequently, even being in this country, the people were very guarded in their language because they still were afraid of saying what they really thought. So that's a caveat on what we are getting from people in support of the government. The significant thing is that 3 or 4 years ago, you would have never had these youngsters speaking up in opposition to the revolution, even with their face covered by the camera. This is a very significant change, and there is no question that there has been a very substantial erosion of the support Castro enjoys with the Cuban population.
Why? Because of what has happened to the communist bloc overall?
There are several factors. The most important factor, in my opinion, is one that is given very little importance in many quarters. The Castro revolution gave the Cubans a sense of international importance. Psychologically, the Cubans were the only country in Latin America that deployed troops across the ocean in Africa and played an important role in the liberation of Namibia and the end of apartheid. This is something that gave Cubans a sense that they were important as a nation. Now, all that has ended, and the most dramatic thing in that respect is the caving of Castro during this meeting with, on the nuclear crisis, when he said that he was no longer going to support revolution overseas. He is trimming down, and when he trimmed down, he's coming to a Cuba that is bankrupt, is very difficult to live, there are a lot of hardships, and then ideologically, the ideas on which he based the revolution have collapsed in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and that's a very important factor also.
Ms. Torres, how much erosion do you see in support for Fidel Castro in Cuba?
Well, I think it would be a mistake to interpret the questioning of certain policies of the government and even the debate that exists within the government itself as being indicative of the support for the downfall of the revolution. The Cuban government, the Cuban nation is a highly nationalistic nation, and I think that much of what has happened historically has been support for nationalism, for the country, especially when the country has felt threatened. And I believe that there has been an increase in debate in Cuba. Everything's on the table. Cuba is moving towards a mixed economy. Cuba is beginning direct elections to the National Assembly. Cuba is beginning, the debate that is occurring right now is how to really empower that National Assembly. I mean, right now it's a body that only meets several times a year. And one of the debates that's ongoing right now.
It's a mixed socialistic picture that
Exactly,
we're seeing.
exactly. That Cuba's going through a transitional period right now. And obviously when you go through transitional periods, there is a lot of debate and there's a lot of questioning. And I think it's important not to interpret that again as a support for the downfall of the government.
Would you agree with that interpretation, Ms. Gunn?
Yes, with one adjustment. I would say that currently Fidel Castro has less prestige among the Cuban people and is less popular than at any point since the revolution succeeded in 1959. However, there is still a...
Why? Why is
because
that?
of the erosion of the level of the standard of living, there's...
It's not just, it's the international, what about the international?
I think that plays a role, but I don't, that plays a role, but it's not critical. I think the major problem is what those young people were talking about, that life is incredibly difficult. It looks as if it's going to become more difficult, and there's no prospect put forward by Castro of an improvement in the near future. But that said, when these people who are very upset with the current system look to see what kind of alternatives might be available, they tend to perceive that the alternative is capitalism imposed by exiles from abroad. And most of the population is very strongly against that.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Betancourt?
Yes, I would like to raise a point on what Alicia has said.
But I mean, would you agree with Ms. Gunn's point that most of the population would not want a return or a change to a capitalistic system imposed by Cubans in exile?
Well, I don't think they reject capitalism that much. It's not an ideological thing. I think that they reject Miami exiles who are extreme right-wing. There isn't a single black person in the Cuban-American National Foundation, which is the most influential Miami lobby group. And of course, as Ms. Gunn has mentioned, you have a situation in which a large proportion of the population is of African origin, and they therefore feel totally left out of this group that is constantly on the radio saying that they are coming in, they are going to take revenge on the people there. Not all of them do, but enough of that goes through the Miami radio station that broadcasts to Cuba that create that fear. These people are coming to roll back everything. Why should I move against the regime if they are going to threaten me? And this is really what, instead of helping the situation in Cuba move, what it is doing is giving more cohesion of the people around Castro.
I want to ask you about this execution yesterday of the exile. This man had, Mr. Betancourt, by the way, no relation.
Absolutely no relation.
Had grown up, lived in Cuba, fled to Miami, 9-10 months ago, and then came back in a small boat, was caught with the other two people who tried and convicted of terrorism, and killed by a firing squad. What does this say about what Fidel Castro is thinking? What message is he trying to send? Ms. Torres?
Well, I think that it's unfortunate that what happens in these types of incidents, as well as with the killing of the other incident that happened the same week, which is the killing of several young soldiers in Cuba by a group that was trying to leave the island. And I think what is unfortunate about these incidents is that, in essence, the major price is being paid by the families on both sides, in Miami as well as in Havana. And I think that what happens is that the humanitarian issues are used by both governments, the Cuban government and the U.S. government, to send messages to each other. And I think the message that is being sent from Cuba is basically, if you're going to come into the United States, from the United States and try to interfere in our internal situation, you may pay dearly, you may pay with your life.
But there's also this crackdown that's been reported on the internal dissidents. Several people were picked up and put in jail, and some of them may apparently still be in jail. What's going on? Is he feeling insecure despite this very tight security system we're told that he has in place? Ms. Gunn?
I think it's a mistake to assume that every decision in Cuba is made by Fidel Castro himself individually. My sense is that there has been a debate within the top ranks of the Cuban Communist Party about just how to handle the dissidents and the human rights activists, and that while the economic situation did not appear to be too dire, there was a willingness to let what I would consider to be the more reformist elements in the party argue that dissidents and human rights activists, as long as they did not violate the law in flagrant ways, should be allowed some political space. I think that around November, when the economic situation really began to deteriorate quite dramatically, that element in the Cuban Communist Party began to lose influence, and the more hardline element, which had been calling for many months for a crackdown on the human rights activists, gained the upper hand, and that's what we're seeing.
Fidel Castro says that the CIA is behind the dissident movement in Cuba. Is there any truth to that, Mr. Betancourt?
No, I don't think that the CIA is behind that. The CIA
Is the United States government supporting, pushing in any way?
Well, I think that the dissidents are people with a lot of experience in dealing with a repressive regime, and they will not be foolish enough to be associated in any way with the CIA, because the CIA has a very poor history in dealing with people inside Cuba. They have been infiltrated time and time again, so these people are not going to be putting themselves in that danger. But I think that there is a regime that is scared, is realizing that it is collapsing ideologically, collapsing strategically, economically, and therefore the only resort right now is to go to more repression. There is a point I want to make.
And what's going to happen if there's more repression?
I think that the repression is going to quiet people for a while. Look what is happening in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was the subject of a tremendous military operation on our part, have been not able to export oil, and yet he still continues because he's a ruthless, repressive apparatus that is using against the people.
What will happen after that?
What happened after that, in my opinion, is that the regime will end in an explosion, and the youngsters in there who ask for somebody to kill Castro are the ones who are reflecting a general mood of the population.
We've got less than a minute, Ms. Torres. You don't share that view, that it was going to lead to an explosion.
No, I certainly don't. I believe that what is happening is that the United States, because of our policy of isolation, we're not isolating Cuba, we're isolating ourselves. The Latin American countries have chosen to engage Cuba and have been quite verbal with Cuba with respect to the political reforms which we're seeing. Cuba's going through a transition, and Europe and Latin America are participating in it, and we're not.
And it's a regime that will survive, and do you share that view, Ms. Gunn?
I think that Cuba is more likely to undergo violent upheaval now in the next 12 to 24 months than at any point in its history, but that it is not a foregone conclusion, and it is perfectly likely that this regime could hang on for another 2 years at least.
Well, Ms. Gunn, Ms. Torres, Mr. Betancourt, we thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, the major stories of this Tuesday: the Supreme Court agreed to hear a case challenging Pennsylvania's strict abortion law, and the United Nations Security Council demanded Libya surrender 2 men indicted in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. The resolution was approved unanimously. Good night, Judy.
Good night, Jim. That's our news hour for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night with the flap over how much American executives are paid. I'm Judy Woodruff. Thank you and good night.
Videocassettes of the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1. This is PBS.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And funding for the Iowa broadcast is provided by Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, since 1861, an environment for academic excellence. And by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour.
You're viewing Iowa Public Television. Enjoy more TV worth watching in 1/2 hour.
Next time on Nova. The Cold War may be over, but U.S. and Soviet subs are still locked in a deadly game of underwater hide-and-seek.
Dive!
Stalking its prey, this nuclear submarine carries more firepower than was unleashed in both world wars. 3 months underwater with no